Given you're tired, you're poor, you're huddled masses, yearning to be free. That's never been quite as unvarnished in American life as it sounds.
The Bill of Rights Radio Education Project presents Without Due Process, Prejudice in the Application of Constitutional Rights to Citizens and Non-Citizens.
I'm an American-born citizen, and at the time of the evacuation, had 2 young children and was pregnant with a 3rd child who was later born in a stable at Fresno Assembly Center.
Sponsored by the Pacifica Foundation and the American Civil Liberties Union Foundation.
Everybody celebrates the Bill of Rights when things are good. It's the day that they're angry and threatening noises and shadows appearing that you fold the Bill of Rights quietly and put it in the bureau drawers to pull out on a sunny day.
With major funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Well, I'd like to welcome all of you to Ellis Island. Now, what we'll be doing is roughly following a route that the immigrants would have taken. Anyone afraid of ghosts?
There is a myth of an ideal America, founded as a sanctuary for anyone who wants to come here, a new colossus whose strength is born from diversity. But the history of our immigration policy contradicts that notion. From the beginning, black Africans were denied free entry. The Chinese Exclusion Act became law in 1882, and the first of the tests and quota systems began around the turn of the century, and they continue today. It is an ever-changing process. Who is welcome here, and which of our constitutional rights will we grant them once they are here? In times of national crisis, even American citizens can find themselves ethnically isolated, unprotected by the United States Constitution.
Washington. The White House announces Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor.
Let's remember Pearl Harbor as we go to meet the foe. Let's remember Pearl Harbor as we head to the Alamo.
We were at war with Japan, and the United States government feared an imminent attack on the vulnerable West Coast.
When an epidemic of physical disease starts to spread, the community approves and joins in a quarantine of the patient.
The country was in a mood of wartime panic when President Roosevelt declared the West Coast a military area and issued Executive Order 9066. It authorized the Western Defense Command to exclude all people of Japanese ancestry from that zone, saying it was military necessity. First, officials imposed a curfew on the Japanese Americans, and then it ordered them into relocation camps in the interior. Most of the more than 115,000 people who were interned were American-born citizens. Few were charged with individual acts of espionage or sabotage, and few were tried for those crimes. They were deprived of their constitutional rights on the basis of race alone.
With baggage and carry-alls hanging from my arm, I was contemplating what I could leave behind. A soldier said, "Let me help you." He proceeded to pile everything on my arm. And to my horror, he placed my 2-month-old baby on top of the stack. He then pushed me with the butt of the gun and told me to get off the train. Knowing when I stepped off the train, my baby would fall to the ground, I refused. But he kept prodding and ordering me to move.
American citizens of Italian and German ancestry suffered little discrimination during the war. But the blatant violations of the constitutional rights of the American-born Nisei and of their parents were approved and condoned by the President, both houses of Congress, and the Supreme Court.
I have in front of me a copy of Life magazine from April 6, 1942.
Rhonda Abrams is the San Francisco Regional Director of the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith.
And this article is entitled "Coast Japs Are Interned in Mountain Camp." And there are pages of pictures of these Japanese Americans going into this most desolate area with their few meager belongings being put in the middle of scrubbed desert. And the captions are, look at all these happy people who are happy to be relocated to this incredibly desolate location.
Sounds pretty tough to me. But still, when you read about the way American prisoners of war are treated in Japan, it doesn't seem too bad at that.
Now, hold on a minute.
the cases are not comparable at all. These people are not prisoners of war. They were not charged with anything except having the wrong ancestors.
Oh, that's right. You said 2/3 of them are American citizens, didn't you?
It's the greatest violation of the civil liberties in the history of the United States since slavery. No doubt about it, and it's pretty much agreed now that the whole thing was an excess exercise of military power and not needed at the time.
Edward Ennis is a member of the board of directors of the American Civil Liberties Union. He's talking about the most fundamental rights guaranteed to all citizens by the United States Constitution. The Japanese Americans were denied the freedom of speech and assembly protected by the First Amendment. They were deprived of liberty and property without due process of law, a violation of the Fifth Amendment, and the Fifth and 14th Amendments ensure equal protection under the law. But these protections failed the Japanese Americans. During the war, Ennis headed the Alien Control Unit of the United States Attorney General's office. He says he opposed the mass evacuation on civil libertarian grounds, but his objections, and those of Attorney General Francis Biddle, were ignored. Ironically, as members of the Justice Department, they were obliged to defend the administration's policy.
No military or security information was ever developed which would support the evacuation. The Army wouldn't agree to such a thing as an individual hearing because it had no evidence against individual persons. It just wanted to clear the West Coast of all persons of Japanese ancestry, period.
Rhonda Abrams.
Someone said to me, and I think it's really true, that if 1,000 people, only 1,000 people, had marched down Market Street in San Francisco saying, "We don't want the Japanese Americans interned," Roosevelt would never have gone through with it. I think one of the most important lessons we've learned from the Japanese American internment is that apathy is a far greater threat than just hatred.
The relocation centers seemed necessary last year, but we're finding that under the influence of the conditions in which they live, many of the evacuees are losing something very precious to them and important to the nation, their faith in democracy, which is the only way of life they'd known.
We seek redress for the gross violation of our constitutional rights. We were forcibly evicted from our homes and placed in concentration camps by our own government. We spent 3 to 4 years behind barbed wire, all without charges, without trial, without a shred of evidence, and solely due to our ancestry.
Nearly 40 years after the internment, the government officially recognized that a mistake may have been made. The 96th Congress created the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians. It held a series of hearings across the country and took a closer look at what had happened to the Japanese Americans during the war.
Colonel Boris T. Posh, Western Defense Command and 4th Army, 1940 to 1943. Colonel, we're delighted to have you here.
The question of the 1942 relocation from the Pacific Coast of persons of Japanese background must be reviewed and studied in the context of the time, the events, and the circumstances when all this took place, and certainly should not be subject to Monday morning quarterbacking. I do not believe that our nation owes anyone an apology for those emergency measures.
We apologize for our mistakes in life, don't we?
It was not a mistake. A mistake is when you do something wrong. Under those circumstances...
I'm Valet Josue de Cristoforo of Salinas, California. I well remember those final days at Tule Lake. I felt so lonely and abandoned that I readily burst into tears. And whenever the children saw me cry, they would ask me, "Mommy, why cry?" All I could reply was, "Because we are here." They were so young and they were so little. Mr. Chairman and members of the Commission, would you have had an answer for my children?
Most Japanese Americans obeyed the curfew and evacuation requirements of Executive Order 9066. Some considered it their patriotic duty, and others felt they had no choice. But 3 men felt it was their patriotic duty to challenge the order because they thought that the violation of their rights was a danger to all Americans. The Korematsu, Hirabayashi, and Yasui cases went all the way to the Supreme Court, where the original decisions against them were upheld. The court said that the order did not violate the Fifth Amendment right to equal justice under law. The government can treat one group of American citizens differently on the basis of their race when it is deemed a military necessity. Ed Ennis.
I think that in time of war, if there was a serious feeling in the military authorities that such an action was required, it would be done again. It's a military precedent that American citizens of any group can be subject to mass expulsion orders by the military in time of actual war.
As you diminish the rights of an individual, you diminish the rights of all.
Minoru Yasui.
The decision, unfortunately, in the Hirabayashi case, Korematsu case, in my case, is the law of the land. There has been no reversal of that. If we attack the whole concept of whether or not the government may enforce an order against a minority on the basis of race, certainly then the evacuation orders would have to fall. You know, American citizenship rights are like a bundle of sticks, and if you break one stick, you weaken the whole bundle.
In early 1983, Yasui, Korematsu, and Hirabayashi brought their cases back into the courts. They hope that new evidence from recently declassified documents and the court's increased sensitivity towards civil rights issues will result in the Supreme Court reversing its decision. Former Attorney General Ramsey Clark.
Some of our most compassionate and devoted defenders of individual freedom were directly involved in the internment itself. We have to realize that even constant vigilance is not sufficient to liberty, that there has to be a vision and a courage and a compassion beyond mere vigilance.
Iran has invaded American territory when they took over our embassy. If we're going to have any bargaining chips at all, by means of which to get our own hostages back, we should round up the enemy aliens, namely the Iranians, and put them in detention and hold them.
That was former California Senator S.I. Hayakawa. The Bill of Rights protects everyone in this country, visitors and illegal aliens, as well as citizens and resident aliens, and it is unconstitutional to arrest or detain a person without charge. But do these protections extend to people standing at our shore, trying to get in? In 1980, 125,000 Cubans came here seeking refuge. Thousands found themselves crowded into guarded camps where they awaited asylum hearings. Thousands of Haitians, fleeing from poverty and the repressive regime of Jean-Claude Duvalier, met with the same fate.
Imagine that kind of situation where people flee their country of origin, they get in a boat with the likelihood, as many of these boats have, of sinking. They finally get to the United States, and instead of being welcome here, they're thrown in a federal penitentiary.
Ira Kurzban is an attorney with the National Emergency Civil Liberties Foundation in Miami.
In worse conditions than federal prisoners, and kept there for 15 months.
Wade Henderson is legislative counsel at the American Civil Liberties Union in Washington, D.C.
Many of these persons were held in federal prisons, were cut off from communication with family and relatives, were cut off from communication with their own attorneys. Many of these individuals suffered physical and psychological damage in the process of detention. Therein, a very serious problem with violation of due process of law.
We Haitians coming here in flimsy leaky boats seeking political asylum and seeking justice and freedom, it seems that we're not going to get it. Someday victory will come, but right now we're really in the middle of the dark night.
The Haitians' vision of freedom must have been far different from what they actually saw when they arrived in the United States. They've found the path to assimilation and success to be far more difficult than they imagined. But that's been true for each ethnically distinct group that immigrates to America. They've come face to face with the darker side of the American dream. Professor Paul Murphy, University of Minnesota, Department of History.
It all seems so terribly ironic in many ways because the United States is a nation of immigrants, with the exception, obviously, of the American Indian. But by and large, we've always been rather ambivalent about this process. I mean, there are good immigrants and there are bad immigrants. There are some immigrants who melt and become a part of the mainstream. There are others who do not melt properly. And these latter we tend to worry about.
Charles S. McCoy is Robert Gordon Sproul Professor of Theological Ethics at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California.
We've never been simple idealists in America, and those who view the American dream as the core of America are not correct. There's always been this mix of self-interest and of altruism. It's when the rights of particular groups and persons come into conflict. How do you work those out?
It is in the continuous play of competing interests that immigration policy is created. The current policy conforms to the United Nations protocol relating to the status of refugees. Each refugee must apply for political asylum.
I want to hear what she has to say.
Your Honor, so do I, and I don't want it to be biased by the fact that she has a lifetime of fear of questioning such as this. I'd like a ruling on my objection.
At an INS exclusion hearing, the applicant has to prove a well-founded fear of persecution if returned home. It must be individual persecution based on political, religious, or racial grounds. Oppression or terror that affects an entire nation does not qualify. The criteria tend to exclude people fleeing from the Caribbean and Latin American nations, those described by UN Ambassador Jean Kirkpatrick as friendly authoritarian regimes, such as Haiti.
She's been sworn in, and I request a continuance.
No, counsel.
1 minute to confer with my client.
No, counsel. I want to hear what she has to say.
30 seconds, Your Honor.
I want to hear what she has to say.
Your Honor, so do I, and I don't want it to be biased by the fact that she has a lifetime of fear of questioning such as this. I'd like a ruling on my objection.
Overruled.
I would like to proffer for the record the reasons for my objection.
Denied. Please ask her to stand, Ms. Denaro.
Art Shanks is the INS Deputy District Director for Northern California and Nevada.
Almost 100% of the Haitians that we're handling today who are coming to the United States are hungry. Their per capita income is less than $300 a year. There is no way to make a living there. They are, by our definition, economic refugees. We're not questioning the fact that they're starving. They're not eligible as political refugees simply because there is a dictatorship in Haiti. Most of these people are farm folks. They have no dealings with politics. They just simply can't make a living there.
Myself, I have my relatives who have been suffering in Haiti.
The Reverend Gerard Jean Juste is director of the Haitian Refugee Center, Incorporated.
My mother has been in jail and arrested, harassed in Haiti, and I would be happy to take her out. It's not a matter of job, it's a matter of real persecution. There is the constant threat whenever at night they coming and take you away.
Attorney Ira Kurzban has represented hundreds of Haitian asylum applicants at their INS hearings. He believes that the INS discriminates against the Haitians on both political and racial grounds in violation of their civil liberties.
At virtually the same time that we were saying to Polish refugees, you can stay in the United States, we're giving you blanket approval, we were locking up Haitians as they were entering the United States. And that's because it's a function of America's foreign policy, not really a function of any immigration issue. I don't think that we would have ever locked up white refugees whose only crime was that they were seeking asylum in the United States as we have Haitians. The only other time that we've ever done it in our history is with Japanese Americans. Other than the foreign policy issue, I think there is no other explanation, but that's just pure and simple racism.
Transcriber, the following is my oral decision in this case. Please refer to the beginning of the tape for the heading. Paragraph, the applicant is a 19-year-old single female native and citizen of Haiti who last arrived in the United States by small boat on or about the 10th of July, 1981. It is ordered that the applicant be excluded and deported from the United States pursuant to the provisions of Section 212.820 of the Immigration and Nationality Act. If there's nothing further, then the case is closed.
Well, the lawyers for the Haitians have been the principal problem in all of this.
Dan Stein is press secretary for the Federation for American Immigration Reform, an educational lobbying group based in Washington, D.C. They promote restrictive immigration policy.
One of the arts of being a good immigration lawyer is that you keep your client in the country as long as possible, however and whatever it takes. And the lawyers for the Haitians, of course, realized that as a means of generating sympathy for these poor Haitians who were being kept in camps, they get the news media out there, they get everybody out there, here's the plight, these poor people. Never, of course, occurring to anyone that the Haitians certainly are welcome to simply go back to Haiti, all expenses paid. And there's never really been any evidence that these people are being harassed tremendously. There's not that much evidence that the Duvalier regime is really all that concerned about it.
Yet, in a 1980 decision in the Haitian Refugee Center versus Civiletti case, the conservative judge, James Lawrence King, wrote, "Much of the evidence is both shocking and brutal, populated by the ghosts of individual Haitians, including those who have been returned from the United States, who have been beaten, tortured, and left to die in Haitian prisons." Judge King found that the INS had violated the Haitians' due process rights. He ordered them to grant individual hearings to the Haitians, to advise them of their rights to counsel and appeal, and to release all Haitians who were interned.
I have been in the Chrome Center for 11 months, and I'm very happy to be released.
A recent case has further expanded the constitutional rights of aliens. In April 1983, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals in Atlanta decided that the federal government did discriminate against the Haitians on the basis of race and national origin. Attorney Ira Kurzban.
This decision is really a landmark decision, primarily because it's the first case in American history where, on the basis of the Constitution, a federal court has found that the federal government has discriminated on the basis of race and national origin. If we look back on these types of cases historically, the one that really comes to mind most immediately are the Japanese internment cases. This case is the first case where the same issue was raised, the same provisions of the Constitution were invoked, and the court found that there was discrimination.
If the higher courts continue to expand the protections of the Bill of Rights that are enjoyed by non-citizens, the nation's immigration policy will have to change. It would not be the first time that the Supreme Court has radically altered public policy. In 1954, in a case called Brown versus the Board of Education, the Supreme Court reversed its 1896 decision and declared segregation to be unconstitutional. Since then, minorities and the powerless have turned to the courts. But this avenue might soon be closed. For the first time in 30 years, Congress has begun a major rewrite of the immigration laws. One of their goals is to streamline INS procedures, and one of their proposed solutions is to restrict the use of the courts. Wade Henderson of the American Civil Liberties Union.
Reducing access to the federal courts is not the solution to the control of illegal immigration. Courts are the only avenue available to these persons to establish their rights under our own constitutional framework.
The framework, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, remains the same, but our understanding changes. The civil rights movements of the 50s and 60s bred a greater awareness and acceptance of ethnic diversity in our society. As a result, the assimilationist stream is breaking down. Though we pride ourselves on our cultural pluralism, we are also afraid that it will be divisive. Some people warn that the emerging diversity threatens the fragile consensus of American society.
Most Americans tend to think of ethnicity in terms of restaurants. Acceptance of somebody's food doesn't mean acceptance of somebody's culture.
The persons that come over should have a sponsor. It should be seen to that they fit into society.
You got so many different people here, and it'd be okay if everybody could live, together and be all right, but it can't happen that way.
Learning the language should be required. They have to learn the language. This is America, and they are coming here.
Instead of having anyone and everyone come in at will, why not take care of our American people? Our men and women are out of work.
INS Deputy District Director Art Shanks.
People are still coming seeking a better life. Problem is, we're almost full. We're in the immigration business, and we're willing and able to do our job. The question is, how is this going to affect my grandchildren and your grandchildren, you see, down the line 20 years from now? Are they going to have to compete with these refugees from Indochina for jobs that we feel historically should be our grandchildren, and they shouldn't have to compete for them?
Dan Stein of the Federation for American Immigration Reform.
In the debate, there is a constant fear that those who want to keep down the level of immigration are motivated by a desire of retaining cultural dominance in the country. And it should not be used as a means of scaring off those responsible, well-meaning individuals who simply recognize that the United States simply cannot take everyone who wants to come here.
Each immigrant generation, as it becomes Americanized, looks down its nose at the succeeding immigrant generation and pronounces it un-American.
Professor of History at Georgetown University, Leo Rebuffo.
The head of the Ku Klux Klan in both Virginia and Maryland is an Italian Catholic. The Klan itself was founded as bitterly anti-Catholic. I suppose that's progress of a sort. But the irony is that these Italian Catholic Klansmen don't recognize the affinities that their grandfathers would have had with current Latin immigrants.
Professor of Theological Ethics, Charles McCoy.
It's not that everyone must become the same as everyone else, but there must be some sort of shared vision. Part of the American covenant is the conviction that protest and criticism are part of it. The human rights for which we strive always are a criticism on the present and an ideal toward which we move. And that is a very important part of the covenant that is America.
Without due process, prejudice in the application of constitutional rights to citizens and non-citizens was produced by the Bill of Rights Radio Education Project. Your announcer is Kathy McAnally. This program was produced by Ginna, Allison, and Addie Gevins with Michael Yoshida. The Bill of Rights Radio Education Project is sponsored by the Pacifica Foundation and the American Civil Liberties Union Foundation, with major funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities. The executive producer is Addie Gevins. The associate producer is Ginna Allison. The project engineer is David Rapkin. The producers wish to thank Moira Rankin and NBC. Editorial opinions expressed in this program are those of the producers, not the sponsors.